This is one of the most consistent mid-range decks I've played in Riftbound. You take an early lead, you convert it to card draw, and then your opponent just cannot catch back up. This is Poppy, Hammer of Momentum. Hey everyone, Matt here. Today we're going to be taking a look at a new deck from the upcoming set Unleashed for Riftbound, and we're going to be taking a look at Poppy, who's a bit of a fan favourite and a deck that I've been very much enjoying. Effectively with this deck, what we're trying to do is basically pressure our opponents with superior stats and great removal and close the game out very, very quickly. But before we jump into the deck and be talking you through all of our choices, we'd very much appreciate if you enjoy Riftbound content like this, if you could hit that like and subscribe to the channel, because it helps us grow, and that would be incredible if we could get more of you coming back regularly to have discussions in our comments and just build better decks in the long run. So let's jump into Poppy. Why are we looking at Poppy when we've already got Fiora and Set, both reasonably strong options? Well, other than the fact that Poppy is new, and I definitely like shiny new stuff, Poppy uses the new XP mechanic. Effectively, you can convert this XP into card draw. Poppy also has the effect that whenever you hold, you get to gain 1 XP. This gives us a pretty good direction for the deck as we're looking into being able to hold battlefields and using the hunt mechanic, which will let us get lots of experience. So this tells us that we're going to be playing a little bit different than we would be if we were, say, Fiora or Set, but we do get the advantage with this deck that we get to draw cards without spending energy. As much as these colors do have card draw, they're usually very, very expensive, and Poppy just kind of gets to sidestep that as we can just spend our experience. So let's just break it up into a core game plan, and we'll go through all of the units, all of the spells, the gears, and the sideboard. And we'll talk about battlefield stuff as well. This will all be over on Piltover Archive, so you can check the link down below, and I've put a full written guide in there, including mulligans, matchups, and everything. So if you need something you can bookmark and keep going back to as you get better with the deck, you will be able to do that. So we have our champion that's given us our direction. We're playing an 8-4 split on runes. The 8 body runes is because we play a lot of power and we want to play punch first, which is one of our best bullying cards in the entire color. One of the reasons that we enjoy playing body. Order we're playing 4 runes for. Now you'll notice in the main deck that I don't have a lot of the order power costs, but our sideboard does definitely use them, so we need to have 4. I'd like to take this down to 3, but you consistently might not get access to your order until a little bit too late. Our initial lineup, you'll notice that we're very, very low on power costs. Our goal is to try to get to about 6 to 8 runes. Ideally 8 is the sweet spot with this deck, so we don't want to be burning power without actually being able to get to that sort of threshold. Then afterwards it becomes a lot easier to make those expenditures. So our units, we're taking a lot of the early game that just has hunt. This allows us to score a point when we do our conquer, and then we get to get a point whenever we hold. And this works very, very well with 2 of our battlefields. We will go over that, all 3 of our battlefields to be fair. We'll go over that once we get into it a little bit more. And we generally top out using the Rune Runner, which is just a card our opponent can interact with in any meaningful way, because it can't be chosen by spells or abilities. And we're also taking advantage of Rengar Trophy Hunter to give us that speed that when we need to get onto a point immediately and start forcing the opponent to present us with answers. Interestingly, we don't play the 4-cost Master Yi in this deck, as I think that card's actually kind of bad. It's only good if you intend to not spend your experience, and in this deck, we're pretty much trying to spend our experience every single turn for Keeper of the Hammer to keep drawing new cards. And once we have more cards than our opponent, we probably are winning that game. So we get onto the points very, very quickly, and then we stop our opponents from getting us off. This will give us our Poppy holds, whilst also giving us our initial conquers. Now ultimately, the low end of this deck is quite expendable, so we don't need to worry about keeping these around for the late game, but once we start getting the ball rolling, if our opponent's forced to make these early exchanges, we can get ahead. One of the key free drops that's new for Unleashed, I really like Neela. Neela, every time she moves, gives us experience, and it also has ganking. Ganking is very important, as it will allow us to get over to the other battlefield a lot faster. We also get Accelerate on this, so we can immediately put this down and shove it at our opponent, get the experience, and then on the next turn we can pressure the other battlefield whilst getting more experience, and then Poppy's giving us cards, and the circle of life continues. Our spell lineup is pretty much all the bullying stuff that we can take. We're taking 3 copies of Challenge. This allows us to hit our opponent's base and also pick off our opponent's key units with our better stats. We're also playing 3 copies of Keeper's Verdict. This is an incredible answer to anything bigger than us. Our opponent will have the choice of putting it on top of their deck or at the bottom. In many cases, if you're taking a mid-size unit, your opponent's not going to want to redraw it, so it just becomes 2 energy, 2 power, delete a unit, which is pretty good. And if they do put it on top of their deck, you've stolen their next card draw, which makes this very, very powerful. Rebuke was a pretty good card, and this is arguably better, and it's not in Chaos. We're playing 3 copies of Punch First as, well, +5 on attack or defense is huge. It lets us get over a wide variety of things. It does cost us 2 power, but for 1 energy, this is great because most counter spells can't interact with this in any meaningful way. And then if we play this on, for example, a Rune Runner, well, we saw how that went in set 2. For our removal, we are playing 2 copies of Hidden Blade and Vengeance. You may see quite a few people that do like to take multiple copies of Hidden Blade. We don't need it for card draw. We're largely using this just to remove really painful units that we have to deal with. So this would be things like your opponent's Elder Dragon or their Vile Maw if they manage to get it onto a point, and we just need a point and click way of killing that unit. Lastly, we're also playing a copy of Vengeance in our removal suite. This is specifically for Elder Dragon. At that stage of the game, your opponent casts it. We want to be in a position where we can remove it immediately so that we can then win the game. We're only holding Vengeance really for when we're in a bit of a difficult spot, but this will help you deal with some of the more problematic stuff. For example, the Blue LeBlanc, when you need to destroy a battlefield that has 1,000,000 Gallios on it. This is the kind of time where having a Vengeance is very, very helpful, even though it's very, very expensive. On our gear side of things, we are looking at 2 copies of Blood Rose. Blood Rose is great. I want to talk about the free cost paradox that Riftbound has, and this card kind of helps with that. But effectively, every time we play a unit, we can spend 1 to gain an XP. This is helpful because we can convert that to card draw. We can also ready the cards by spending free experience. Now, we're only really doing that if we are desperately in need of getting our opponent off a point, when we have an opportunity, or when we're winning the game. And you'll know if you're winning the game because our chosen champion pretty much says, only play me if you're losing the game. So if you're playing that champion, you're probably in a position where you should be drawing as many answers as possible and maybe not panic using the Blood Rose. We play 1 copy of Shepherd's Heirloom. This allows us to spend experience to attach this to one of our units. This gives us +2. It doesn't cost power, which is really, really key, but the problem with this card is that we don't really want to spend too much experience attaching this because ultimately that's cards we're not drawing. Every 3 times you attach this, we are losing a whole card out of it. So we want to be using this a bit sparingly, but the +2 stats for no power cost can help with that early taking dominance over the battlefields. And last but not least, we are playing 3 copies of the Hunter's Machete. It gives us Hunt, but more importantly, it's +2 stats. We're quite happy to put this on Neela, who has ganking, and then effectively we get 2 XP every time we move the unit and conquer. And it allows us to just apply a lot of that early pressure. And we can, for example, chuck this on our Rune Runner, and then that Rune Runner is also giving us experience whilst having +2 going to 7, which can be an awkward number for the opponent to deal with. Other units that you may not normally see is Voracious Gromp. Everyone always underestimates the Gromp. Gromp is actually insane in this deck. With Hunt Free, it's not impressive, but it doesn't have a power cost. It's 5 energy for 5 might, but Hunt Free is very, very big. If we conquer or if we hold, we're going to get a ton of XP, which means basically draw a card. Now, we played Kai'Sa, and Kai'Sa says when I conquer, draw a card. This does the same, but you will say, but Kai'Sa had Accelerate, and you could take it as a chosen champion. Sure, we can't take Gromp as our chosen champion, but we do have a way of pushing it very quickly. The Blood Rose, once we have free XP, we can play the Gromp, just run the Gromp in, gain free experience. Hey look, we've just paid for our Blood Rose, so we can start making Gromp dance across the battlefields and give ourselves quite a lot of advantage from that. And effectively, while our opponent is scrambling to take care of that unit, we are drawing more cards, which is going to give us options to make it very hard for our opponent to remove our units. Now, normally we talk about the chosen champion a lot earlier, but we're going with Poppy Paragon. Poppy Paragon is a really interesting legend, as you generally want to play this close to the end of the game. So your opponent, it comes in ready if your opponent is only 3 points away from winning the game. When it comes in this way, it comes in ready and you get free XP. This means we can immediately spend that XP to draw a card to get back in. But coming in ready with Deflect at 5 might, this can be a bit of an insurance policy to close. If our opponent ends up starting to get back into the game and they get up to 5, we're probably around 6, 7. And we can, yeah, I know I just did it. Sorry guys, forgive me. And then we'll be able to use this Poppy to help run in. And because it's not costing us power, it means we can conserve it for things such as the Punch First or our Keeper's Verdict. So let's go about the battlefields next, as I kind of want to talk a little bit, now that you kind of get an idea of what we're trying to do, we're going to talk about why these battlefields are amazing in this deck. So we have the Gardens of Becoming, which gives all of our units at this battlefield exhaust, gain 1 XP. As we're trying to hold and get XP from our legend and also from our hunt, this is very, very good for us. We can effectively sit units here. If our opponent basically sets up a huge defensive position on the other side, we can hover around the Gardens of Becoming and just start stacking up XP and drawing cards so we can find our answers so we can get over them. We effectively get a God Willow out of this if our opponent sets up on the other side, and we can keep deploying units so we can get ready to siege them off. Another battlefield that's incredible for the hunt mechanic is Reckoner's Arena, and it's worth talking about the interaction. Hunt triggers on Conquer or Hold, which means it is a Conquer effect. So if we are at Reckoner's Arena, when we hold, we trigger our hunt twice. So if we had Gromp, for example, we'd get free for our hold, then we trigger our Conquer effect, which is Gromp again, and we'd have 6 XP. This means we can pay for our Blood Rose or our next 2 draws using Poppy. And lastly, we go for Windswept Hillock. This one's a little bit of an interesting, it's probably a flex pick where if I was going to make some decisions on how we play out the meta, I'm worried about Windswept because LeBlanc uses this very, very efficiently. However, all of our hunt units being able to gank with no additional cards being played means that we're doubling up on our experience and use out of those units. So I do really, really like this, but it is one that if the meta adjusts, we can consider exchanging for another battlefield that suits what's going on. In our sideboard, we have 3 copies of salvage, as there's always gear that you're going to want to remove. This is going to be things such as Aurora, or if you're playing into heavy gear decks like Lucian, or even Vi, which we'll probably have on this channel in the near future. Salvage is always a very, very solid option to have, and it replaces itself. It's also one of the reasons that we have to play for Order Runes, is because we may need access to this quite early in the game, and if we play a split that's even more tilted towards body, we might find that we can't play this when we need to. Stare Down is a card you're probably not looking at when you went through the whole Unleash previews, but this card's actually really, really good in this kind of deck. Stare Down lets us choose a friendly unit, and all opposing units at a battlefield that have less might than that unit get pushed back to their base. This is very, very good against LeBlanc. It's also quite useful into Vex, as it doesn't cost us any power, it's only 2 energy, and we can effectively target one of our big units that has an equipment on it, so for example Gromp with a machete, push everything 7 or less back. If they've got LeBlanc with infinite Gallios, just shove them all back. They're no longer at a battlefield, the temporary will take care of them, then Gromp goes in and gets you a ton of XP. This is very, very good against Swarm decks or decks that just like to play lots of hidden cards and just sort of stall out the boards. You can use this as kind of a bit of a breaker to get in. It also gives you 1 XP, which is useful. And last but not least in our side deck, this is another flex slot. I will go over all the cards that we could consider for the deck, but I do like Heroic Charge. Now, part of the reason for this is that there's a lot of aggression in the early set. We're looking at things like Rengar, we're looking at XPE, and those decks kind of want to engage in combat with you very quickly, and they will spend very expensive combat tricks to take the lead. Heroic Charge gives us an option to stun their unit and shut them down, which makes it so that they can't come back in on us if they've got things like First Mate or other ways of readying their units, and it means that we can just potentially run away with the combat, get the hold, get XP, and we start getting ahead again. This is quite good into aggressive decks. Against green decks, it's probably a little expensive as they play Defy, and they also play not so fast, so this gets hit by both, but if you're playing into anything that's not green, this is actually not terrible, it's quite good. In the considering, there's a whole bunch of stuff I've been looking at, and this is all things that I've been playtesting. Ultimately, I think all of these are going to be very dependent on the metagame. A couple of notable ones that I'm not playing, for example, Master Yi. I don't like this card. We're spending all of our XP, so this card never actually gets to level 6. And then, even if it does, it just basically gets ganking and deflect. Not really great for us. So, even though it fits into that sweet spot on the curve, and no power cost, it's just kind of a bad unit. It's basically Gromp, but bad. So, let's just play Gromp. It's also not a rare, so you're going to be able to pick them up quite easily. The Gromps, I mean. Repulse, pretty good if Pike becomes pretty mainstream, or purple decks like Vex, that's playing lots of stuns, we can start thinking of putting in the repulses to make sure that our units get onto the battlefield and don't get stunned or get pushed back. Fight or Flight is now gone, so our units are more likely to stick around, but repulse can be useful here. Tactical Retreat, great if we're in a prison heavy format, so if things like Victor and lots of the removal heavy decks come out, we can play our Tactical Retreat. BF Sword's really, really interesting, as there's quite a few decks where having over 8 might is super important, and that's going to be against things like Vilemore or Lilia. We want to get to 10 might as a magic number. Particularly for that is Vilemore says anything with less might than it can't deal damage at that battlefield. So for example, we want our Rune Runner or our Rengar or our Gromp to be over 8. So if they try and Vile Maul, we can always clear the Vile Maul off. We do have Punch First to help with that, and we can also keep his Verdict, but because Vile Maul has Ambush, our opponent might put it back on top of their deck. And we can set up situations where our opponent attempts to Vile Maul ambush us, we keep his Verdict, next turn they try to play the Vile Maul again, and then we Punch First out of it, and our opponent's basically just given up 2 turns. We've held probably 4 points, and we've scored a million XP that we can then use to draw cards. And yeah, a lot of these other cards are different things worth considering depending on how things play out. I don't want to go over all of them because obviously they're cards that I've not put in the deck, but depending on how things go, these cards are considerable options. Although one that I think is absolute bait and you probably shouldn't be playing is Poppy Defender of the Week, and my main reason for this is it costs a power. Even if you play this at its reduced cost, we could have just drawn a card. Ambush is great, it's 5 might, so it's kind of a little bit low for a power cost unit. And it has Tank. Tank is very, very useful for what we're going for, but I don't really want to give up the free XP in order to not draw a card when I could just be drawing something like a Punch First, which costs less and lets me continue that hold. And last but not least, I will talk a bit about Trinity Force. I think this card's very, very good for closing games early. We can also use this less so for the double scoring, but more so in the way that it forces your opponent to interact on the battlefields that you want. For example, if we want all of our combats to be happening over, let's say, the Reckoner's Arena, with Trinity Force, all of their removal and all of their attacks have to desperately push you off because your opponent can't just sit on the other side waiting for you to go over there because you're scoring 2 a turn. They're only getting 1 a turn. So that Trinity Force, actually, the biggest use case for it is making the opponent have to do something, which is great for us because we want our opponent to do stuff so we can shut it down and continue to roll away with all of our points. Let's talk a little bit about our matchups. We're very, very strong against aggressive decks, and we're really good into mid-range decks. This is because we have great stats, great removal, and we get a lot of advantage. So when our opponent starts running out of steam, we are able to keep up. We also don't have to waste any of our energy on drawing cards. We don't have to spend time on battlefields that give us card draw. Even though we can play on our opponent's battlefields that give card draw, we don't have to waste time on that because we already have that engine available to us. So this is a huge boon for our deck. We can just focus on the bit that we're good at, which is making the opponent's life very, very difficult. This deck does struggle with very heavy removal-based strategies, so you can see we're playing elite units effectively. Well, you know, except for this Squirrel and this Gemhand Hunter, they're primarily for hunt, as they can give us our on Conquer and on Hold. Our elite units are kind of expensive, so this is why we can't play things like Cold a Week, and we don't really want to get our units killed too frequently. If we're not actually getting the Conquers and we're not getting the Holds, we're not getting XP, and we start falling behind. So removal-heavy decks are a bit of a challenge. Things like Elder Dragon as well, if the opponent just leaves it at base, these can be quite difficult for us without specific tools, and the specific tools available to us are quite expensive. Effectively, if you get in there quite early and you start getting a lot of the hold, your opponent's going to have to start burning power to play more powerful cards to catch up, and you're just running away with the game at that stage. Is we can just start deploying more units, and then we can just start overstatting them, and then it means that they're not getting towards their late game. Before I close it out, I do want to come back to a point I talked about earlier, and that's going to be the deck builder's paradox that we have in Riftbound. Effectively, the deck builder's paradox is free cost units are really, really difficult to play unless they're your chosen champion. And the reason for this is that if we go second, our opponent plays a 2-drop and we play a 2-drop, we end up burning 1 energy. There are certain colors that can get away with this, so that would be things like Chaos, it gets to play stacked deck. But we have this real issue where we end up just wasting an energy if we just play a 2-cost unit and pass. And then our opponent can move on to a point, and then they can play a 4-cost unit, and our 2-cost unit is already outclassed if we move to the left battlefield, say our opponent started on the right. Their next play is going to be able to walk over us, and we probably need to deploy. So you want to put 3-cost units in your deck so that when your opponent plays 2, then 4, your runs over theirs and potentially threatens their next play. We don't have a lot of great options on that don't cost us power. We're playing our copies of First Mate. This is because I'm quite happy to just play this going second as free to outstat our opponent, or maybe get them on their second turn to just spend 2 energy and hold up a combat trick. That gives us a lot of information about where their head's at. We're also quite happy to just drop Neela, even though it costs a power, and spending power early is very, very difficult. We will have the better stats and we can start getting the XP on the run, and this also gives us control over both battlefields in one unit. We probably don't want to accelerate this early, but if we have to, we can. And this is where things like Blood Rose also comes in, is we can also play a 2-drop and a 1-cost gear, and that's where a lot of things fit into that curve. But decks like Diana are very, very powerful because when they have to go second, they can always play their chosen champion, and they never have to worry about that. Their turn 2 will always outclass your turn 1. And that's what I mean by the paradox of the deck building process when it comes to Riftbound, is you don't know if you're going first or second. And if you build your entire deck to go second, and that ever becomes popular, you're going to be fighting against everybody else who opts to go second, and then you end up going first, and you've probably not built your deck to have too many 2-drops. So you always end up in that awkward situation where if the go second strat becomes viable, you build your deck for it, and you may end up massively on the back foot as a result. So that's going to wrap it up for this deck profile. I hope it's been very, very useful to you. Like I said before, over on Piltover, you're going to be able to find a full guide. We're going to talk about mulligans, battlefield selection, how to play the deck, what the curve is, all of that important stuff is actually in the guide over there. But I would love it if you could give this a spin on TCG Arena or Riftbound Atlas, which has just come out. Apparently that's pretty good. Play around with it, see how you get on. I'd love to see more Poppy in the meta. If you're looking for something to grab for a skirmish very early on, this, I think, is a very solid starting point. So yeah, that's everything from our side. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Any of these would be really, really great for us. And I really, really appreciate you. So thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Cheers.